would you say that someone like Paul is the norm for a Pharisee Jewish thinker of the time, or do you think he's a little extraordinary?
I thought you were going to just say extra. He's definitely he's definitely extra. Um, we don't know enough. Just to say, first of all, we don't know enough about what it meant to be a Pharisee in the first century. We really don't. And we only have writings from Paul and Josephus, as far as I'm aware, from that group from the first century, which is really interesting. They've been preserved probably for Christian purposes later on, those manuscripts and these two thinkers. But we actually just don't know enough about Pharisees from the first century, which is really too bad. The material that we have, if I'm not mistaken, are just Paul and his letters and the writings of Josephus. These are the only two sets of writing that survive. And so we have to kind of fill in the gaps, as it were, with other kinds of evidence to put together exactly what it meant to be a Pharisee, especially one, that's traveling around the Mediterranean world in this time, sort of outside of Jerusalem, outside of Judea. And so in that respect, maybe Paul's kind of limited piece of evidence that we have, at the very least, he is somebody who's interpreting the Hebrew scriptures in a way that when I think about what Josephus is doing, when I think about what Philo of Alexandria is doing, they're all saying that, Greek philosophy, let's just call it Greek philosophy, but Hellenistic philosophy, whether we're talking about Platonism, Stoicism, etc., they're all valid philosophies that make very interesting points. But the thing that you see Philo do, that you see Paul essentially say, even Josephus hints at this, is that the Jewish people had it first in the scriptures. That any of these, great insights into the way the world works, into the nature of human beings, the nature of the soul, anything along those lines, there's certainly a kind of cultural competition there. And so I think Paul is not unique in terms of his skill. He is unique in his application of that skill. He's certainly innovative, and he's a very innovative thinker, I think, and philosopher for the first century, and certainly one that has influenced the last 2,000 years. In that respect, yeah, he's pretty unique. But the skill set he brings to the set of questions, the way he approaches them, there are other parallels from the first century of other Jewish thinkers doing the same thing.
Yeah, you mentioned Philo, who's somebody who's, writing in Greek. He's connected to the embassy. He's talking about Plato being the most holy Plato, and comparing Plato and Moses. The way Paul's portrayed, basically, he's half dual citizen. He's a Roman citizen. He's also a Jewish Pharisee. Do you think it's likely that someone like Paul could just decide that he wants to appeal to Caesar and get care where they're okay, fine, we're gonna take you on our boat, we're gonna bring you all the way to Rome, and we're gonna put you in front do you think this is likely to be historical or sort of kind of narrative?
For Paul going to Rome specifically? Yeah. Well, I mean, we know that Paul tried to go to Rome from his letter to the Romans. Like he's writing to a group there of some kind, asking them to fund him to come there. I think I made the joke that my students this last semester said, "Oh, so he's an influencer," and I was like, "Yeah, okay, that's pretty. It's pretty close." He's looking for sponsorship or patronage. That's a little bit different than someone like Philo. What they have in common is this interest in trying to demonstrate how Jewish thought is not at all strange when it comes to these major philosophies of the day, Platonism, Stoicism. In the sense that, again, many of the same ideas are present and that they have something to offer for non-Jews who might not otherwise realize, at least in their mind, that the Hebrew scriptures are, operational in their day-to-day lives that have implications for the lives of everyone, not just the Jewish people. And certainly Paul understands, in the way he reads the Hebrew Bible, is that Gentiles are just Jews who fell away from the one true God. They've gone to worship idols. Think about the golden calf, right? They're worshiping these gods that are not true gods. And so at some point, especially before this end time comes that's been predicted, a certain number of them are going to return to the fold. So Paul takes it upon himself to take that on. He's the one who becomes the apostle to the Gentiles because he understands that a certain number of them are going to realize the error of their ways. They're going to realize that they are adopted sons of, and co-heirs with Christ. You hear this language in Paul. And so all of this demonstrates that these authors are very much part of the fabric of the ancient Mediterranean world. there's not much that actually separates a Jew from a non-Jew in the ancient Mediterranean world, insofar as everybody is interacting, everybody is sharing ideas. There's cultural competition. In Paul's specific case, he views it as his position, his job to bring these people back into the fold.
Well said. Last thing I want to ask you about is, how do you think the process of his letters getting preserved over time and then copied and then like trade, and like now all of a sudden there's in every church there's a copy of Paul's letters, or eventually, I don't know how long that takes, but like, how does that process take about? Or is this just like we just don't know?
Well, there's been some recent research that looks into what we might call like the material aspects of research into early Christianity. And it's not that this hasn't always been going on. I mean, the only reason any of us have a Bible is because there's been, somebody behind the scenes, some academics who can read these texts, and others trying to put together a sensible, coherent document that we call the New Testament, including Paul's letters. That's always been going on. But there's been more research, I would say, in the last 200 years, and even recently, on remains in places like Oxyrhynchus, say, these trash heaps from ancient Egypt that still exist, the arid climate preserving this papyri and that kind of thing. And what we find on occasion are, maybe a piece or two of a letter, like Paul's letter to the Romans, interspersed in a codex with, some of Plato's writings or something like that, right? So I think that, again, he's a philosopher. He is proffering something that's very interesting to people, even if they themselves are not Christian. It's circulating outside of Christian circles as well. It's within Christian circles. Let me draw this distinction, because it's preserved within Christian circles and eventually becomes part of canon, in my estimation, because it's the earliest evidence we have that's written down. So it's the earliest thing that can circulate outside of, say, what people call oral tradition, right? So Paul's going to get preserved for that reason. He writes down these ideas about how we understand that Christ Jesus is who he is, how Gentiles can be incorporated, the significance in human events, again, all of those things. And also really, these nascent ideas about how you would have an institutional structure for what we would call a church, group organization, Eucharist, performing that other acts like baptism. All of that is in his letters. And so those get circulated and discussed and implemented as time goes on. And so, of course, those letters are preserved within a Christian context. Outside of it, his ideas, his philosophy, and his intervention and trying to inform people of this end time scenario, but then later on, just again, ideas around Christ and who Christ is and his return, etc. That could be interesting to non-Christians too. And we might find, again, a couple leaves of Paul interspersed in with some, writings of Plato or anything else, right? These are food for thought for people who are, in my mind, of a literate class and below too, of course. But what we find preserved in that material record seems to be people just having kind of curiosity about these things, or an intention to preserve them because Paul represents that foundation of the church. He's a foundational figure.
And just real quick, last thing. So we, those 7 authentic epistles that we have that are probably written by him, do you think the ones on top of that are like, because there's 2 ways of looking at it. These are deceitful. People are trying to say Paul wrote this, but he didn't, or they wrote these in the spirit of Paul because they think Paul would say something like this.
It's hard to say what the motivation is, right? And I think all theories are operative in this case. I think certainly what you do have, though, once you start to see, I mean, there are some of these forged letters that are not even in the canon that we still have, that are clearly an analogy that I think is helpful is, you remember those like old timey ransom notes you'd see in like old movies where someone like went in a newspaper and like put together like different letters to spell names so you can't tell like who. Like a line from like Romans and a line from Colossians and like a line, and like you could just tell. I think what's going on in some of those cases are one of maybe, let's say, 2 things to keep it simple. One is a problem has arisen in the church. Can we go back to Paul's genuine writings and figure out how he would have answered this problem? Or can we sort of course correct because something he said was like too revolutionary for the times we're in now because the end time hasn't come? It's one thing to say there are no distinctions between any categories of people when you think the world's about to end, but it's a different story when it's been 100 years and you're trying to, live in a society that is still, compressed by the laws around it. So you have that kind of either course correction or reflection to help inform the present day. And then the other thing I think you have is I could bring this full circle to our conversation about Acts, which is you have to fill in the blanks. Paul doesn't tell you everything about himself. He doesn't tell you everything about how this thing started. He doesn't tell you much about his interactions even with the disciples who remain in Jerusalem, except that he fights with them. That's a terrible story for continuity and like unity for the church, right?
Sure.
So you need stories that explain these things. People are curious about them. They want to know more. They want to know how he got out of jail. He tells us he's in prison. So you need an angel with, that can blast off the handcuffs. But also you want answers to when he was in prison, what did he say about it? And this shouldn't seem strange to any of us. Increasingly, I reflect on the Marvel universe and the DC universe, Star Wars too. And we see this in the present day when there are stories that are important to people. You want backstory and fill in the blanks. And what about this? The word we use is lacuna. What about this lacuna? About what happens to, get the message to Leia or whatever, right? You fill in the blanks of these moments when we would call it a fan, and the stakes are higher. You call it a religious, devotion to the question. But you start to see, again, as the church gets institutionalized, you have more structure. Christianity branches off from Judaism definitively, so it's no longer, a Jewish movement exclusively. You start to see the development of these kind of fan fictions along the way, and there are a lot of different motivations for them.
Well said, and there's a lot more on this topic if you sign up for the course in the description, and I'm definitely going to be there. There's so much there's quite a few hours of content, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
So definitely sign up, and you'll also be helping me out as well from my affiliate link. And once again, you have just attained true gnosis.
You have just attained true gnosis. The demiurge has no power over you.